I've had like a really bad fever over the last couple days, so I apologize if my voice is going to be a little bit weird throughout this video. But the Filecoin crowd sale is about to be so crazy over the next couple days that I just wanted to make this video giving some of my thoughts about the white paper, the crowd sale, and all the shenanigans that are about to go down. Let's do it. Okay, so when we talk about Filecoin, we're talking about what's called a decentralized storage network, DSN. And that's actually a name that they coined for themselves. And decentralized storage network would be in comparison to something that's a centralized storage network, like for example, Amazon S3. Amazon S3 is the 800-pound gorilla in this space. They are the juggernaut of file storage on the internet. So let's take a look at Amazon S3 and what makes it so good. Well, first off, it's super cheap, right? It's really fast. They can serve content incredibly fast. It's very reliable. It scales incredibly well, and it has a really great developer experience, not only for using S3, but for integrating with a whole suite of services on the Amazon platform. And Amazon S3 has been so successful that Microsoft and Google are now trying to almost replicate this product in their own cloud services suites to try and get that business model working for them. So there's a lot of competition in this space when we're talking about file storage on the internet. So what makes Amazon S3 is super cheap. What do I mean by that? Well, the current pricing for S3 is around 0.023 cents per gigabyte of storage. So 1 terabyte is 1,000 gigabytes. That's around $23 per terabyte of storage. And that's pretty cheap, right? Like I pay, I have, I think, a few gigabytes of video content for my Decipher series, and that comes out to, like 0.08 cents, like 8 cents per month that I actually pay in file storage costs to store those gigabytes of videos. And then the accessing of the videos is super cheap also. It's around 0.004 cents per 10,000 read requests. So if you do 1,000 views per month on one of your video, that will be 30,000 read requests, which comes out to like 1 cent per month that you're actually paying to read from S3, which again, like this is super cheap, right? And obviously, if you have more popular content, you're going to do more reads. Chances are you're not going to be reading from S3 directly. You'll integrate with other services like CloudFront, which I'll show you in a second. But for the most part, like AWS is incredibly cheap, right? So there's very like tough competition there. When I say it's fast, Amazon offers a variety of services, one of which is called CloudFront. CloudFront is their CDN service. So basically, you can take content that you have stored in an S3 bucket, and Amazon has data centers all over the globe, right? So you can say, like, this is Australia, and then this is Europe, for example. And what they'll do is when you put content into an S3 bucket, they'll automatically replicate it into their data centers all around the world. So if you have a user, for example, that's in Australia somewhere, and he requests to watch your videos, he can just read directly from the local cached content in the Australian data warehouse, as opposed to having to go all the way to your computer in like San Francisco to get access to the content. So because Amazon has just such great business dynamics, they can have data warehouses on every continent, and they can serve content to users incredibly quickly. So I mean, it's super fast, right? It's the reliability, like I was saying too. S3 has something like 99.9% uptime, which is really good for an internet service of this scale. And there have been times when it's gone down. Like somebody a couple months ago, like fat fingered a script and took all of S3 down on the East Coast, which then again took all the internet down because everyone uses S3 for file storage. So there might be some issues with having one service have that much kind of backing of the internet, but it's still like very reliable for most developers. It scales. I mean, the scale that this thing is going at, I think that it has multiple exabytes, right? So I think that there's multiple exabytes of data hosted on S3. So an exabyte is 1 million terabytes. And I think like all of Facebook is about like 1 exabyte of data right now for all of Facebook. So S3 has more content stored on it than even Facebook. And Amazon is just such a juggernaut that they're going to keep expanding this. So it does scale really well. And like I said, it has this really nice developer experience. So that's what we're dealing with S3. I mean, like, really can't be understated what a juggernaut this system is. And going up against it, so Filecoin trying to go up against S3 would be like if you were trying to make a search engine and you're like, yeah, we have to go up against Google. They do a really, really good job. but we think it's worthwhile to go up against. And maybe they're right. If someone was making a search engine to go up against Google, I think that's an incredibly worthwhile project. So it might be worthwhile to try up and go up against this. Their basic idea, right, is that you have to add like an ER to like all of these things that S3 offers. So like you can make something cheaper, faster, more reliable, right? Something that can scale bigger and has an even better developer experience. Like this is hard to do, but they believe that using this decentralized model could actually, provide a plausible means to defeat S3. And when we talk about these decentralized storage networks, the biggest one right now is BitTorrent. So when I was growing up in like the early 2000s, there was, a bunch of these kind of decentralized peer-to-peer file sharing systems. There were things like Napster and Kazaa and LimeWire, and they all kind of like had their moment in the sun and then faded away. But BitTorrent was the thing that kind of persisted. BitTorrent was built in 2001 in a college dorm room by a guy named Bram Cohen, and it was massively successful as a means to share files without needing any kind of central authority, the way that Amazon S3 has Amazon the company as the central authority. And BitTorrent, I think right now accounts for approximately 3% of all internet traffic, and it has something like 150 million users. And this might even be a higher number, right? So this is a massively successful system, but there are problems and fundamental limitations of the BitTorrent system that prevent it from reaching the kind of scale that S3 has. So first big problem with BitTorrent is that it's slow to initially connect. So for example, you can use BitTorrent to like download files, but you can't like use it to serve web content. You can't serve a website out of BitTorrent or a video on a website because it's so slow to have that initial connection. The other problem that BitTorrent has is that there's no incentive to run a node, or at least no economic incentive to run a node. And this is where the kind of cryptocurrency stuff becomes interesting. Because, I mean, the people run BitTorrent nodes to like fuck the system and stuff, but like you don't get paid for doing it. In fact, you might even get like, authorities coming after you for running BitTorrent nodes if you're hosting or seeding content that is, technically illegal. But if you could get paid, right? If you get paid to run a BitTorrent node, how big could that file system be? Like I don't run BitTorrent nodes. I rarely ever seed content on BitTorrent. But if somebody said that they would pay me to do it, I might have, terabytes of hard drives in my apartment running it because it's a way to make money. So if you could add an economic incentive into something like BitTorrent, it could be really incredible how big that system could be. Third problem with BitTorrent is that like the content addressing scheme is really weird. So you don't have like permalinks to content, and this is something that the Filecoin team has looked into significantly. You have like these weird magnet links, and you have duplicate content all the time, but like you don't have any way to like permanently address content on the BitTorrent network and just share that link around and then have the client know how to download it. So I think what Filecoin is saying is that if you could fix these kind of issues with BitTorrent, you could actually build a peer-to-peer file sharing system that could reach Amazon S3 usability and scale, only it would have the advantage of being decentralized. And that could be a remarkable breakthrough for file sharing. That's at least what they're going for. So the basic idea of doing one of these decentralized storage networks is that you would have, like a user, and he has a file that he wants to store, and you have like a node right here that has like some hard drive space. And he would basically send you like some sort of crypto token and the file and be like, hey, store this. And you'd be like, cool, yeah, sure. And you basically rent out your own storage space in like whatever hard drive you have, and you get this token as a reward. And then when anybody requests this, so like when any user requests the file, they make the request with another crypto token, and you could then serve them the file. And you basically are getting paid for your bandwidth over here, right? Bandwidth over here and your storage over here. And if you get the incentives correct on this, you could build like a massive scale network of peer-to-peer file sharing. Well, okay, so that's the basic idea. But before even reading the Filecoin white paper, there are just a couple like things in my head where it's like, okay, well, these would probably be challenges of doing this. And then these are the kinds of things that I'm interested as I read the paper of seeing how they address. So problem number one is like the obvious kind of like outsourcing attacks you could do to cheat a network like this, right? Outsourcing attacks. So imagine I have a node on this network, and somebody gives me money, right, to store a file. I'm like, okay, cool. I will totally store that file for you. Well, then I've got, like another hard drive over here, and I secretly just pass that file off to this hard drive. Well, now I have another node that says, hey, I will store this file also. So someone gives me the file, they send me money, but then I just pass that off to the hard drive. So the hard drive over here is the one that's actually storing the file. I'm not actually storing these files on these nodes. But now if a user, right, comes and requests the file from me, I can just ask this hard drive to give me the file. It gives me the file. I give the user the file, and the user's happy. I get paid for this node. I get paid for this node, even though these nodes aren't actually storing the file. So I'm lying about how many times I'm actually storing the file because I'm just sending it over to this guy over here. But in terms of giving the files back to the user still gets it, so he doesn't know any better. So how is the network going to deal with these kinds of attacks where people can essentially game the system and not give the reliability that they claim that they're having? The second thing that I'm interested in is how they deal with these kinds of like tragedy of the common problems that would emerge from a network like this. So one of the cool things about this network is that it has like these kind of like built-in auto-scaling properties to it. And this is one of the reasons why a decentralized storage network is interesting. It's like, so, okay, so if I am, a node and I have a file and a user requests it from me and they pay me to give it to them, well, what happens if they request a file that I don't have? Well, I'm going to need to go get it from another node. So I will probably need to pay that node and then get the file and then give it to the user and get paid. But what is happening is if I am the node and I have that file locally, then all I'm doing is getting paid by this user. I don't actually need to go request it from another user and spend money in order to get it and then run this at a neutral cost. I actually make a profit if I have the file. So each node would then be incentivized to cache frequently accessed content locally on that own node. Because if you have frequently accessed content, then you get paid more when it gets accessed. So this kind of like auto scales the network through economic incentives, which is really cool. But the question is then, how do you incentivize any node to host infrequently accessed content, right? Infrequently accessed content. Because there's no individual node that would be incentivized to host infrequently accessed content. But the entire network needs to host this kind of content and not drop it. Because if the network is dropping infrequently accessed content, no one's going to trust the network, no one's going to use it. It sucks for everyone. But it's no individual's responsibility to lose out on the benefit of hosting popular content. So how are they going to deal with this kind of like tragedy of the commons problems that emerge? And then the third kind of like question that I have is like, how are you actually going to make this fast? So like BitTorrent works really great. It's just slow, right? But like, how am I going to make it if you have these like dynamics where like people are bidding in a market, right? In like a two-sided market, like buy and sell orders to like access content. Like, how is any of this going to happen fast enough to serve web content? That is my real question because I mean this needs to be like sub 100 millisecond speeds in order to like work on the web. So can you actually design a system to access content once it's stored that can give you this kind of speed? I'm curious about that. And then the fourth thing, right, that I'm curious about is how you're going to deal with censorship and DRM, takedown requests. So imagine you're, back to Amazon S3 here, and somebody puts like a leaked episode of Game of Thrones up on one of their S3 buckets, and they just like pass out the link on a forum. Well, HBO could see this and be like, yo, Amazon, somebody just posted like something super illegal, and we want to take that down immediately. Well, Amazon, the company, right, could just like delete this and then they could like suspend the user and be like, dude, you just broke the law. And like that's why this system is allowed to thrive. And it's not just like HBO, it's like the FBI. Like what if someone puts like WikiLeaks style kind of like internal State Department communication, or like in Turkey, right? Like there was this huge issue where the government banned Wikipedia. So like, what if you hosted Turkish Wikipedia in Turkey and the government wanted you to take it down? Well, with Amazon S3, they can just like make formal requests to Amazon to take it down. But if you have a decentralized network and it's open source, right? Well, how exactly are you going to deal with that? Um, that is a real question that I'm interested in. Are you just going to ignore these guys? Because that's kind of like what the other systems have done, or are you going to play ball with them? Very, very curious what Filecoin's perspective on that is. Okay, so first things first. Filecoin will be creating its own blockchain called the Filecoin Blockchain, and it will have its own protocol token called FIL. And this will be freely tradable on exchanges, and this is what they're selling in their pre-sale, this FIL token for this blockchain, right? And I totally understand why Filecoin is building their own blockchain, but it may come as a slight surprise to anyone that remembers back to the Ethereum Developers Conference in September when Juan Benet announced that they would actually be building Filecoin virtualized on top of Ethereum.
So we are excited to announce that we are building Filecoin as a virtual chain directly on top of Ethereum.
So a slight change of heart there, I guess. Now, how they're breaking this down is when you have disk space, right? So say this is like some hard drive, they're going to break this into what are called sectors, right? So like a sector is a piece, a dedicated piece of your hard drive. And what you're going to do, they're going to have two other data structures here. They're going to have what's called a storage order book and an allocation table. And what you're going to do when you want to, you dedicate storage space to Filecoin is you're going to pledge a sector into the order book. So I'm going to pledge a sector. And when you pledge a sector, you're going to put up a deposit of Filecoin. So you're basically going to pay Filecoin as a deposit to put a sector of your disk space into the order book. And the storage order book is just going to be like, it's going to be like, here's some disk space, and hey, here's some people with data that they want to put in your sectors, right? So it's going to be like some sort of market for storage right here that's going to live on chain. Now, what's going to happen, which I think is really interesting, right? So like somebody has a piece of data, let's just call it a file, and they're going to break this into pieces, is what they call like pieces, right? So one file couldn't have many pieces. I'm not exactly sure what the ratio of like pieces to file is, but this is the basic idea. But anyway, you are going to, in this order book, assign a piece to a sector, right? And that's what this allocation table is going to store. It's going to basically have a list of sectors, and then it's going to have, which piece of data they're supposed to store and how long they're supposed to store it for. And this is just going to be like one massive data structure that lives on this Filecoin blockchain. Now, what I think is really interesting, right, is that when you are assigned a piece of data for a sector, you are going to seal it, right? And you're going to create what they call a replica. And a replica is a sector-specific piece of data. So it knows about the ID of the sector, right? And this is to mitigate against those kind of like Sybil and outsourcing attacks that we're talking about, where like you're storing one file in one place, but claiming 3 people have it. Well, no, you're actually going to need to store these replicas that are ID specific to the sector, right? And then they introduced this like super interesting kind of idea, which they call like the proof of space-time, like POST, proof of space-time. And the idea here is that you're going to have a replica assigned to your sector. So it's a very specific piece of data that you're storing. Well, as you go, right, you need to constantly be posting proofs that you still are storing this data and that you didn't delete it. But if you kept, like pinging every second the blockchain, saying that you have the file, that's not going to be really efficient. You're going to use a lot of bandwidth. You're going to take up space in these blocks on their chain. Like it's not gonna scale very well. So they introduced this concept, proof of space-time, which says that you're gonna need to compute some sort of hash, right? And basically the input is gonna be the piece of data, or the replica rather. So the sector-specific piece of data is this replica, and then you're gonna need to compute a hash running some function. and that's going to give you a hash. And then that hash is the input to the next function, and you need to run that. And that is the input to the next function. You need to run this over and over and over and over again. And let's say, for example, every 1 billion computations of this hash, the billionth thing, you then post that to the blockchain as a proof, right? So every billion, and in order to have calculated this, you need to have had the replica stored locally, and you needed to run some function a billion times, which can take a fixed amount of time in real time, right? So these things that you're posting every, billion computations, somebody could verify that you actually did run a billion computations on that replica, and that would essentially let them be convinced that you're storing the file locally and that you stored it for a specific amount of time. And if you don't post those proofs to the chain, well, then they have your deposit, right? So they can kill your deposit. So there's actually economic incentive for you to then keep the file locally and constantly post those proofs. The whole storage market thing is pretty interesting also, because the user, right? Like the user can basically specify for their file, hey, I want to have 1,000 replicas of this file on your network because it's super important. I don't want to lose it. And I want it to be stored for 1 year. So these are all kind of like user level customizations that the user can then just pay extra Filecoin for. And then 1,000 sectors of storage can agree to store one of those replicas. But the user can specify kind of the parameters that they want, and then the market can decide how much that should cost and who should host it. So this entire thing might be like a really interesting construct. And then there's also going to be this thing called a retrieval market, right? Which is going to be separate from the storage market. And this is going to be also an order book of like, hey, requests for different pieces of data, and then people can answer those requests and give them that data for Filecoin, right? I'll do it, but I'll do it for money. And this is going to be really interesting because you can't do this on a blockchain, right? Like it's going to be too slow. Like somebody has to make a request and then somebody has to fulfill that request, then actually send them the data. And like how fast does this market get resolved? That is a huge question to me. But you can't do this on the blockchain. This has to be all be done off chain. So how is this going to work in terms of resolving to the main chain? And how fast is this actually going to be? These are my big questions about the retrieval market, but they don't really dive into too much detail about it in the paper. But it's interesting that they do draw this distinction between retrieval and storage. And not only do they have different order books for the retrieval and the storage, but a node can either be one or both of these. So you can have a node that only partakes in the storage market, and you can have nodes that only relay data as part of the retrieval market. But most likely, you're going to have one node, and that node is going to do both. It's going to store data, and it's going to participate in the retrieval market. So one computer mining rig setup for Filecoin will probably participate in both of these markets. And you can see, right, like in the paper on page 7, they do like this kind of like architecture outline that says, here's our storage market on chain, here's the blockchain itself, and then we've got this like off chain thing for the retrieval market that involves micropayments and something. But it's not like clear to me how this is going to work specifically. Another thing that I want to point out is that later in the paper, they talk about creating this kind of smart contract system on top of the Filecoin blockchain. And I don't want to undersell the ambition of this project because they're really talking about building a back-end storage engine for a variety of different blockchains. And that's going to require custom integrations to be written to use the specific features that different blockchains and cryptocurrencies offer. So I don't have too much insight into how this kind of smart contract platform would work, but I think it is interesting to read about, and I think it is interesting to start thinking about like what the actual ambition of the Filecoin project might be if it succeeds at scale. Okay, and now let's talk about the Filecoin Crowdsale because this is really something. Up until now, pretty much every Crowdsale or ICO that has happened on top of Ethereum could pretty accurately be described as a complete shit show. It's companies that have tokens that are immediately tradable and they just raise ridiculous amounts of money, and it like in 10 minutes they'll sell out millions of dollars, and those tokens will immediately get flipped on exchanges, and the people investing in these things don't even care about the product whatsoever. They're just trying to make a profit, and like the products will probably never even ship. Like they're terrible ideas for the most part. It's really just like this crazy ecosystem. So Filecoin, and to their credit, in an effort to be responsible, is partnering with AngelList to create a new crowdfunding platform for cryptocurrencies called CoinList. And the idea of CoinList is that you will have to register for the crowd sales with your AngelList account. And that, if you click register, that includes know your customer information. So there's no anonymous donations. You have to actually, put your actual identity on the line with how much money that you're staking. They're also creating this new legal document called the SAFT, or Simple Agreement for Future Tokens. So if you've ever hung out with like early stage startups, there's a very common legal agreement called the SAFE Agreement, the Simple Agreement for Future Equity, that early stage ventures use. It was created by Y Combinator as a way to help entrepreneurs. Because when you're just raising like your first, let's say $50,000 trying to start a new venture, you don't want to have to worry about things like valuation of your company before you've even launched your product, or like board seats, or like like really complex equity breakdown cap tables. Like you just literally need money from somebody that's like a good friend and believes in you, and you like have to have a legal agreement to say like, yeah, you're entitled to some portion of this company in proportion to what you gave. But like you don't need to hash out all the details. So they created this simple agreement for future equity. It's a very common investment vehicle for early stage startups. They're basically making a version of this called Simple Agreement for Future Tokens, where you can legally, right, like not anonymously on Ethereum, but like legally invest in an early stage startup using cryptocurrency tokens. And then you have this like agreement, this legal obligation to get some sort of future tokens back. This is really great. I love that they're doing this. I think CoinList will be a massive success. And this is all really good. But now it starts to get interesting. First off, in order to participate in this crowd sale, you need to be what's called an accredited investor. So what does an accredited investor mean? Well, it means that you have $1 million worth of assets, basically. I mean, like there's technicalities to that, but like it's essentially saying that you are a millionaire in some capacity. So the only people that are actually able to participate in this crowd sale are people that are accredited investors in the US, which means that they are millionaires. So take that for what it's worth. I don't know how strict this like actual like accreditation process is. Like I think that I have heard of people gaming it and just lying about things and not getting caught. So I don't know like how strict this is if you really wanted to participate, or if like you had a friend that could get accredited and you just gave them money. Like I don't know how that whole thing works. But for the most part, this is like super exclusionary. They're not including a lot of people with this obligation here. Okay, and then there is the actual crowd sale itself. So what Filecoin is going to do is that they're going to pre-mine 30% of all FIL tokens that will ever exist. 70% of all FIL tokens will be mined once the network is live, right? Once the network is live. So of this 30% of the tokens that they're going to include pre-mined in the Genesis block, 10% are going to be sold in an ICO crowd sale. And this is going to happen a couple days from when I'm recording this. So chances are if you're watching this, this will have already happened. So in this ICO crowd sale for 10% of all Filecoins, they are raising an uncapped amount, which means an unlimited amount. We don't know how much this is going to be, but it could be anything. Now, check this out. Before they're even having this publicly available crowd sale, and by publicly available, I mean millionaires only crowd sale, they had what's called a pre-ICO. I mean, like this shit literally makes itself up, pre-ICO. And they sold $52 million worth of Filecoin tokens at a rate of 0.75 cents per Filecoin token, fixed rate. And this was, I think, like 69 million FIL tokens were sold in this pre-ICO round. So who's in this pre-ICO round? Well, they said it was like investors and, advisors and people that had worked on the projects before, which brings up this like question that I have about this project to begin with. Like there's this thing like Protocol Labs, and then there's like IPFS, and then there's Filecoin. But I'm not really like sure what the difference between these three things are. Like this right here is a venture funded startup. They went through like Y Combinator and they have, investors. And this IPFS was an open source project that is currently open source. Filecoin is like a new project. But how related are these three things, right? Like if they're giving investors in Protocol Labs Filecoin tokens at a discount, and they're giving developers that worked on IPFS Filecoins at a discount. Like, how linked are these things? Like, what is the difference between all of them? I'm not really sure. It's not really clear to me, like, how those three things play with each other. Um, and anyway, this pre-ICO, they already did this. So they already raised $52 million selling it at this rate. Now they're going to have an uncapped crowd sale, right? And the way it's going to work is the price per Filecoin is going to go up every $40 million that gets raised. So if you are in like the first $40 million that's raised, and by first, I mean like in terms of time, like this could be in time, like seconds from when the crowd sale opens. Like you might get Filecoin at like $1 per Filecoin. But like if you're over here, which could be like 45 seconds later for all I know, it might be like $7 per Filecoin. Like assuming that if they raise like $1 billion in this thing, like you might be paying like, I don't know, $13 per Filecoin over here. So like this is already like literally insane that they're gonna have a crowd sale where like 15 seconds could affect you by like 7x what your actual valuation is. Like that seems fucking crazy. Like it's just gonna be like a mad dash for people to get in. I hate these incentives, by the way. I hate when people do these like early bird incentives where it's like, hey, if you're earlier, you get more. Because it's like a weird dynamic. Like you should invest because you believe in the product, not because like you're like have this like crazy FOMO. Also, like what the fuck is this shit? Where like you have early investors here that got in at 0.75 fixed per Filecoin in like this like under the table round. And then you might have guys over here, you know, like paying like $10 per Filecoin, but they are taking the same risk, right? They're getting in at the exact same time. So I mean, essentially, you're creating this like fucking pyramid scheme where like investors here that got in this like pre-ICO thing, they have their fixed valuation, and you're gonna have a crowd sale that might end up at a valuation down here where like these guys are already 10x their original investment. They did nothing. Like they're already in. They're already 10x. So even if when this becomes publicly tradable a year from now when Filecoin launches, even if it's at this valuation at the end of the crowd sale, these guys at the top of the pyramid are already 10x'd. Good to be at the top of the pyramid, bad to be at the bottom of the pyramid. So like this whole dynamic to me is just like a complete joke. Like I really don't like this. Let me tell you, man, CoinList is good. This is a good scheme. We really made a dent with seed stage venture capital with ICOs. We kind of just like went around them and started funding projects and making returns without them even being involved. And they got us back, man. CoinList is good. This is gonna be a battle. All right, touche, venture capitalists. Now that they've made their move, it's our turn to fight back. Okay, now if we go back and look at those kind of like original questions I had going in, I would say number one, they have dealt with very well. They have a lot of information and a lot of thinking about how they're thinking about Sybil attacks, outsource attacks, something else that they call generation attacks, which is when you don't actually store all the data, but you store just enough that you could generate it on command. They have novel ideas and approaches where I'm convinced just by reading they're thinking that they're going to solve these very well. So I'm convinced that they've got that on lockdown. This kind of tragedy, the common stuff, I'm also pretty convinced that they're going to deal with in a smart way. They talk a lot in the papers and some of the other research about preventing deletion, right? Like they don't want any deletion on their network, and tragedy of the commons would be in that. So they are thinking about these kind of problems. Retrieval speed, I would say, is a real big question mark. This is going to depend on how the retrieval markets work, and this is that off-chain retrieval market, and we just don't know. There's not enough information. So this is a big kind of outstanding question. And then number four, I think is a really big deal. So this is not only like, this is just like completely sidestepped. Like they just completely don't even bring this up at any point, like how they're thinking about this. And that's kind of concerning to me because this is like a pretty common question, I would imagine, and they don't even address it. And it does give me a little bit of concern, especially given, like we were talking about, the way that they're raising money, which is going to be like, like let's call it $500 million that they're going to raise in this pre-sale from institutional VC and millionaires, right? So if you're raising this kind of money and now you're thinking I have to return this money at a profit for my investors, well, you're not going to go the route of, hey, it's open season on posting anything you want on this network. Like, look at the guys that have done this, like Julian Assange, who's now locked up in an embassy in London, or like Kim.com, who had his house raided with like Apache helicopters, and Peter Sund of Pirate Bay, who he like went to jail, right? So I think that they're going to play ball with FBI and Hollywood, right? Um, and try to implement some sort of DRM overrides. But like, how are they going to do this, right? How are they going to put DRM overrides into an open source system? This is like a super interesting question to me. I'm not really sure. Because, right, like you can't just like hard code like, hey, here's some admin string. And if this admin string makes a DRM request, then you have to take it down. Because if this is open source code, then like, couldn't someone just like fork this away? And just like fork the code base and just remove this and then like run that, and it's like, hey, the censorship free Filecoin network. Really, really interesting question. It kind of like makes me question some things now that I'm thinking about it more, and it's like, are we sure that this is even going to be open source? Are we sure that Filecoin is going to be open source, or are they going to have some sort of closed source component? Because this DRM thing is super. It's going to be really important for their investors, right? Like they don't. These are not the people that care about a free and open internet. These are the people that care about making returns on their money. People that care about the free and open internet are the ones that don't have millions of dollars and like they live in Turkey and like they can't read Wikipedia and shit. So I'm really questioning how this is going to go down. And if you think that maybe this is like going a step too far, I think there's like a pretty decent analog to this, which was the story of MakerBot. I don't know if you guys follow like 3D printing at all, but when MakerBot first started, it was like, an open source hardware company, and all that the hardware that they made was completely open source. And they had this site called Thingiverse that was like where people could post open source printer designs. And it was like this really vibrant community. And with the replicator too, they pivoted and made their entire hardware stack closed source. And it was a really controversial decision. And like it led to like one of the co-founders leaving. And I don't know. Are we going down that pathway with Filecoin? I don't know. But I'm very concerned that they didn't address this at all in any of their literature. Okay, so clearly I still have like questions about this system, but I mean that I guess that's kind of natural, right? Like if you're gonna try and make gains, right? Like GAINZ gains, you're gonna need to invest capital or mind share with incomplete information, right? Like if you had complete information about how the system would work, well then that would be priced into it, right? So you have to be able to invest time and money and resources with incomplete information if you want to make profits from it. So given what we know about Filecoin, is it a good investment? Or even if you're not investing, like, is it a good trade? Like, will you make money from putting money into this thing? I don't know. It's really interesting. I can kind of see it both ways. So with Filecoin, I want to just say I buy the premise of Filecoin. Like, I completely am bought into the premise. I believe that you can make a decentralized storage network that scales to multiple exabytes, that has economic incentives, that makes it profitable to mine and store data, that serves data in web scale speeds, and is completely peer-to-peer. Like I completely believe that you can do that. So then the question is Filecoin going to be the implementation of that works? I don't know. Right? There are things that concern me. The Crowdsale certainly concerns me. The lack of clarity around their censorship strategies concern me. The research itself seems pretty intelligent. It seems like they have put a lot of work into it. If they're getting $500 million in their stack, they're going to hire a really killer team to work on this. I mean, that cannot be understated what kind of advantage that money gives you in pursuing this idea. They've got great investors behind them. I mean, top of the line. They seem like they've got a pretty good team. I can't really speak to it personally, but people that I know that know the Filecoin and the Protocol Labs guys, they really speak highly of them. So it seems like they've got a really good team. Let's think. So if it wasn't Filecoin, what else would it be, right? Like so there's like the inherent execution risk that they don't execute, and then there's like the competition risk that they're beaten by someone better. So the only other things that are out there that I know about are Swarm, right? So Swarm is the Ethereum Foundation project that's trying to build a decentralized storage network. I've heard very good things about Swarm, but I don't really have that much information about it. They're not as like public with a lot of their like stuff as Filecoin is. Like, or maybe they're just not as far along as Filecoin. But like, I've definitely not been able to get that like up to date information about Swarm. But I know that that project is brewing, and there are people that think that it has a lot of potential. So that's another thing to look into. There's Siacoin also. So Siacoin is already in production, and it's building a decentralized storage network. I have not looked into Siacoin very much, so there could be an opportunity there. They're in production, right? So they're already ahead of Swarm and Filecoin. Filecoin itself, right? They're not going to launch for another year, I don't think. So from what I can gather reading the literature, they're going to have an implementation of Filecoin hopefully done by the end of the year. So like Q4 2017. And then maybe they'll launch the actual blockchain summer 2018, so Q2 2018, something like that. So basically, if you're putting money into Filecoin, you're not going to have liquidity on the blockchain for the year until they launch and then until you vest. So like you might have like a 6 month, if you take the shortest vesting period, it'll be 6 months. So you'll have a 6 month vesting period as an investor. So you're probably 18 months to liquidity by putting money into Filecoin. Well, what can you do in that 18 months? Could you just buy hardware and mine Siacoin in the meantime, and then mine Filecoin when it launches? And is that going to give you a better ROI than putting money into it and also mitigate your risk? I don't know. I don't know. That's an interesting question. I think also is how do you want to play this if you want to mine? Like, should you just buy the hardware now and start mining on Siacoin, and then you can mine Swarm, you can mine Filecoin, you can be hedged, right? Where if you're just putting straight money into Filecoin, you have that execution risk to deal with. So yeah, I don't know. I don't know. I think this space is super interesting, though. I think Filecoin is a really interesting project. I'm very interested to follow it closer. I'm very interested to get involved. Like, I want to work on Filecoin. Like, this stuff seems really cool. Um, and yeah, I think probably just given the names that are behind it, it'll probably be a good trade if you put in money. I mean, I doubt people are going to lose money on this, right? So so I don't know. Filecoin's super interesting project. I think everyone should just follow along because they're probably going to need to post more and more specifics. And I think, like I said, it'll get really, really interesting when they have an implementation. So when there's the first like actual code, right, like written for the Filecoin network, and hopefully that comes by the end of the year. So anyway, those are just my crazy thoughts on this thing. Peace.